Good afternoon, Robertson Wesley. My name is Shylo. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm the Affirming Ministries coordinator here at Robertson Wesley United Church. Welcome to Affirming Reflections. Today's topic is going to be about the term passing. So stay tuned for a little bit of what that means, some of the pros and cons to it, some of the types, and maybe having some conversation in the comments of sometimes where you personally have gone through passing or know someone who has. So some of you might know, some of you may not know, what is passing? So passing is a recently popular term within the transgender community, but it's relevant in sociology, and it's a term that's used for all identity groups. So passing is the ability of a person to be regarded as a member of an identity group or category different from their own. So this can include things like racial identity, ethnicity, caste, social class, sexual orientation, gender, religion, age, or disability status. So there's a bunch of groups that this term can apply to. Historically, though, the term passing has referred to mixed race or biracial Americans who were identifying as or being perceived as belonging to a different racial group. So what are the pros to passing? So passing may result in a lot of privileges. It may provide the person with some rewards or an increase in social acceptance. It may also be used to cope with the stigma of being part of an oppressed group. So some examples of the privileges and rewards could be economic security, it could be personal safety, it could be having a really great community. There's a bunch of reasons as to why passing would be beneficial. Some even say that passing may serve as a form of self-preservation or self-protection in instances where identifying as or expressing one's true identity may often be dangerous. What are some of the cons to passing? So passing may require acceptance into a community, but this also leads to a temporary or permanent leave from the community that they previously belonged to. Thus, passing can result in separation from one's original identity or original self. It can be a separation from original family, friends, or previously lived experiences. So while successful passing may contribute to economic security, safety, avoidance of stigma, it also takes an emotional toll on people as a result of denying one's previous identity, denying oneself, and it can lead to things like depression, self-loathing, anxiety, and suicide. So what are some of the types of passing? So I'm just going to go through a few of the identities, what passing looks like within those identity groups. So the first one is racial passing. So this is starting to become a little bit more prevalent now in the news. We see in the book titled Passing and the Fictions of Identity, written by Elaine Ginsberg. They cite an ad for an escaped slave back in the 1800s. The slave's name was Edmund Kennedy, and it was an example of racial passing because Edmund was a biracial person and was able to pass as white in the United States. At that time, for light-skinned African Americans, during the time of slavery and segregation, the intense period of racial resegregation followed. So passing as white was a survival tool that allowed them to gain experience, gain education, gain employment that would have been denied to them if they identified or expressed that they were indeed a colored person. So the term passing has since been expanded to include all other identities and ethnicities, and discriminated groups in North America and Europe may modify some of their accents, maybe some word choices that they have, sometimes the manner of dresses that they wear, grooming habits, and even sometimes they'll change their names in attempt to appear as members of a majority group or of a privileged minority group. In terms of class passing, this one's more common in the United States in places where there's a huge gap between the rich and poor. It's also linked, especially in the United States, to the American dream. And so there's this idea of upward class mobility, and thus the higher class you are, the more status and privileges you get with that. For those who are not heterosexual, so passing by sexual orientation usually occurs when a person's individual sexual orientation is perceived as something different. So a lot of this has to do with visual identity. So the term visual identity refers to the expression of personal, social, and cultural identities. And this usually happens through dress and appearance. So others often read our appearance and make assumptions about our wider identity. So therefore, visual identity is a prominent tool for non-verbal communication. So presenting oneself as heterosexual is an effective way of passing. And many of you may be familiar with stereotypes, with big masculine men being usually straight, tiny feminine men being gay, even masculine-looking women are often perceived as being gay as well. Certain types of styles, so the short hair and the flannel is often a stereotype for lesbians. So those types of things that people see and assume will create people to look a certain way. And so if people who are in a sexual minority, they often will avoid those stereotypes, even if that is part of their identity, just so they can effectively pass as straight. We also see Gina Ulis, I can't pronounce the last name, but they're a writer, and so they note that the presumption of heterosexuality in most modern cultures, this is also known as heteronormativity, is often the cause of gay men and women spending a great deal of their lives passing as straight, even if they don't do it intentionally. Now, this is kind of where the terms coming out and in the closet may come into play. It's because we are all assumed to be straight until told otherwise. And so this is a weird, unintentional passing that happens frequently to pretty much everyone in the world. And welcome, Anna and Pan. Gender passing, on the other hand, refers to when an individual is perceived as belonging to a gender identity group that differs from the gender that they were assigned at birth. In the same book by Elaine Ginsberg, The Passing and Fictions of Identity, they provide a story of a man named Brandon Teena, who was an example of gender passing in the 1990s. He was assigned female at birth, but in 1993, Brandon moved to Falls Cities, Nebraska, where he was initially able to pass as a man. However, when community members discovered that Brandon had been assigned female at birth, 2 men in the community shot and murdered Brandon. So we see that there's a lot of harm and no safety when it comes to being in society and being sometimes our true selves. Another strange thing with gender passing, and this is why I brought up the fact that in the trans community it's very prominent now, is because within the transgender community, passing refers to this perception or recognition of a trans individual as belonging to the gender identity to which they are trying to transition to, rather than the sex or gender they were assigned at birth. So it's a little bit of a switcheroo. Sometimes gender passing is seen as a good thing in the trans community, and for others, it's seen as a bad thing. Sometimes, actually, people will pass for another religious identity. This one's not as common, but individuals may appear to worship one way, but secretly worship in another way. Often this is due to persecution. We don't often see that a lot in the West. The only examples that are prominent here would be a child being raised in a certain religious household and not wanting to identify with that religion. And so with that, it's often hard for youth or even young adults to kind of come out as, a different religion or maybe having no belief at all. But in other places around the world, sometimes being perceived as a certain religion is life or death. And so I was reading earlier reports of Jewish men trying to fake having non-circumcised penises just so they wouldn't be thrown in concentration camps. So it can get as hard as that, where things are very violent and very gruesome, and it could be as simple as just not wanting to be made fun of, which are all a variety within the idea of passing. And Pan mentions, are you going to mention stealth? I didn't plan on it, but we can definitely talk about it at the end for sure. I totally forgot that that's a thing, so thank you for the reminder. So yeah, we'll definitely talk about that near the end. Disability passing is a intense and complicated understanding as well. It's a little bit more, it has both sides again. So disability passing may refer to the intentional concealment of an impairment in order to avoid the stigma of having a disability. However, it may also describe the exaggeration of an alignment or impairment in order to receive some benefit, which may take form of attention or medical care. So passing as disabled is kind of a category here where people with disabilities may exaggerate their disabilities when being evaluated for medical care or accommodations, often for fear of being denied the support they need. These pressures can result in disabled people exaggerating symptoms or tiring out their body right before an evaluation so that they're seen on a bad day rather than a good day. When I was reading this often reminded me of the trans community as well. For many folks who don't identify as a binary and those who are non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid, who do wish to transition in some form or another, there's a lot of gatekeepers in the medical community that require you to have some sort of threshold of gender dysphoria or need or want and desire to be a certain type of binary gender. And so that gatekeeping resulted in a lot of trans people conforming to a binary in order to get the hormones and surgeries that they required. And once they were there, they were able to come out again as non-binary or shift whatever identity that they had. Also in the disability community, there's also passing as non-disabled. And this is the more common one, where individuals whose disabilities are invisible, such as people with mental illness, intellectual or cognitive disabilities, or even physical disabilities that are not immediately obvious to others, such as IBS or Crohn's disease, may choose whether or not to reveal their certain identity and pass as normal. So while passing as non-disabled may protect them from discrimination, it also results in the lack of support or accusations of faking it. Many people in the autistic community employ strategies for them in their community known as masking or camouflaging. In order to pass as non-disabled, this can involve behaviors like suppressing or redirecting some of their repetitive movements, avoiding talking about one's interests, or even faking smiles in environments that are uncomfortable or distressing for them. So masking may be done to reduce the risk of ostracism or abuse, but it may lead to, again, depression, suicide, and just overall decline in mental health. Individuals with visible physical impairments or disabilities, such as those with mobility issues, including those who use wheelchairs, scooters, face a greater challenge in trying to conceal their disability if that's what they would like to do. So for them, having a visual disability is sometimes harder to engage in passing if they try to desire to do that. So this is kind of where I'd like a little bit more comments. I guess we can talk a little bit about stealth. Thank you, Pan, for mentioning that. So stealth is similar to kind of the way that the autistic community has known their strategies of masking. Within the transgender community, our passing term is from a positive standpoint, is known as stealth. So this is where trans folks identify as a certain gender, and they are often, almost always, perceived as that gender, which then reduces the knowledge of people knowing of their trans identity. So for example, myself, I do not get misgendered as a female anymore. I do pass as masculine or male identified almost 100% of the time. And so there's times where people don't even think that I'm transgender because they think that I am a cisgendered man. And so this often alleviates my identity as being trans, but it's also helpful in situations where my trans identity may put me in danger. So many folks in the trans community aspire or desire being in a stealth way, in a stealth lived experience. So many folks don't identify with their trans identity and only want to identify as the gender that they are. And there are some, like myself, who are okay with identifying myself as transgender and not holding on to that stealth idea. And it depends on also the situation that people are in. There have been times, and I know there will be times, where I identify as strictly male and I keep my trans identity a secret. And so in those moments, I do go stealth, but it's not a lived experience like many other trans folks where they don't even come out at all as trans and they live their lives being perceived as cisgender. Pan says the key is the desire to not have anyone know. Exactly. It's exactly that. It's not having to explain ourselves all the time. And I know that is probably the biggest desire with stealth, is just not having anyone know, because it's not really as important as people need it to be. And there are often times where people's lives are just so much simpler if they don't have to always explain themselves. And so that's kind of the odd thing within the trans community, where there's problems with passing, but there's also difficulties with passing, depending on the scenario. So we're going to talk a little bit about passing statements. So this kind of comes full circle with passing, with stealth, with all of these ideas. So passing statements are known as microaggressions. They're often said in very harmless ways, but often these statements come across as very insensitive and out of touch. Often they reinforce false stereotypes about certain people groups, especially for transgender people. Framing passing as good insinuates that the only way for transgender or gender nonconforming persons to be deemed acceptable in society is by them aiming to look cisgender. It's often the idea that the goal of transitioning is to look cis. That is kind of the mentality that we have. And so it shifts the focus on trans people's appearance rather than the information that cis people in our societies need to know in order to respect us as trans people. And also says, you all need to watch Disclosure on Netflix. Very interesting expose on representation on the media and where the terrible stereotypes are rooted. Wow, that's awesome. I definitely want to watch that. So I'm going to add that to my watching list. Thanks, Pan. So some of you might be wondering, what are some of these problematic passing statements? So I'm going to read a few. And for those watching, if you have a few that you've experienced yourself or have heard others say to either a friend, or even sometimes it's the things that you might have said to others. These are some of the passing statements that are common that I've heard personally or that I've heard within the community. Some of them are, I didn't even know you were trans. I get that one a lot, where I come out as transgender and people are like, oh, I couldn't even tell. Those kind of, it's like a backhanded comment. It's like, thank you for appreciating my masculinity, but at the same time, you're being insensitive to the fact that trans people have to look a certain way, and if I don't, then that's a bad thing. There's also other microaggressions or passing statements such as, you look really good for a guy. I know I've gotten that one a few times, where people have experienced me later on in my transition and seen photos of me pre-transition, and just appreciating that I look better as a man than I did as a woman. Again, these are backhanded comments where, again, it's appreciative that you appreciate my masculine identity, but then you're essentially making fun of or not being respectful to my past identity. There's even the opposite, where people say, like, I could totally tell you were gay, or you don't strike me as gay. These are also ones where, the stereotypes are there, where, I mean, if you can't tell that someone was gay, that means you're assuming that certain stereotypes are true and are universal. There's even some that I've heard where people say, "Oh, you're too pretty to be queer," or "You're too pretty to be gay," or "Oh, it's such a shame that you're gay because you're just so beautiful." So these are another way of passing statements that are, again, sometimes meant not to be harmful, but for the most part, they do come across as harmful for the people that are receiving those comments. Even things like ethnicity, or even religion, essentially you can put you're from wherever, you don't look like you're from there. So many different ways that these statements can be kind of changed to adapt certain types of passing categories and identity categories. So if any of you have experienced this, please throw in some comments about some of the passing statements that you've experienced, or that I didn't mention yet. These are very LGBTQ focused, so that's really good. I know when I tell people that I'm Métis, a lot of people say, "Oh, you don't look Métis," and I'm very aware of that. I am white passing, and I do identify as such. So when I tell people that I do identify fully as Métis, that is my ethnicity, that is my race, if you want to use that word as well. But I do understand and I do know and identify as being a passing white person. Regardless of my ethnicity, I am perceived as white, and so I get the rewards and benefits of being a white person. And so that's kind of where these pros and cons come in with passing. So in conclusion, passing can be both good and bad. Oftentimes, passing is a way for us to navigate our world in a safe and secure way. It's not until we get to a place where we're all respected and understood with all of our different human identities that passing will no longer be necessary. We must move away from our cisnormative and our heteronormative understanding. We must move away from white superiority. We must move away from ableistic ideals. And we should move away from understandings and ideas of uh, what humans should be or should look like. Métis says, "What do Métis look like?" Question mark. Exactly, and that's kind of where these statements are kind of just not helpful, because they're assuming that there's an answer or a distinct ideal, when for mostly all of these questions there is none. And so it's this false idea that there is some sort of goal or ideal or thing that we must try to look like. So even we are all uniquely different, and those differences need to be accepted, they need to be understood and celebrated, and only then will we no longer need to pass in order to be safe and secure. We'll be able to live in a world where our identities don't have any results in us not having food, water, security, community, and I hope that that community comes sooner than later. That's all I have for the live stream today on passing, and some of the good and the bad that come from it, and why it can be inherently negative and also inherently good for the time being. And so hopefully in our lifetime, we'll be able to move away from this passing ideal and this idea to get to a certain point in our identities, to look a certain way and be a certain way. I personally do not want to be a cookie cutter human. I am myself, and there's no one else like me, and I love that. And there's no one else like you, and I love that. And so we really need to start appreciating the differences between us, rather than trying to conform us all into little cookie cutter people. So, and yes, Pen, we'll see you on Thursday. Next Monday, there won't be Affirming Reflections. It is the long weekend with Thanksgiving, and I will be away. So I'll see you the week after on Monday. And for those that don't know, every Thursday at 11 a.m., I host a Affirming Coffee Hour. It's just an hour where we drink coffee on Zoom and we just chat about our lives, certain topics, maybe questions that people have. It is open for all LGBTQ folks and allies. If you want to just kind of sit in and kind of listen in, you can. If you'd like to come and ask some questions, you can. It is a drop-in as well, so don't feel like you have to stay for the full hour. If you'd like to join in halfway through or leave halfway through, that is also okay. It is very casual, so come and go as you please. So for those that would like to join on Thursday, please just send me a message or an email, and I can just quickly send you the link for that. And that's every Thursday. So for those, I'll see you Thursday, and if not, I will see you all 2 weeks from now. Take care, everyone. Have a good rest of your week.